Well, good evening, family. It's good to see you all tonight. Glad to have the opportunity to be here with you for the Vacation Bible School. Last Monday, I had a chance to be with the Clinton Church of Christ for their Vacation Bible School. And it's always fun to go to these VBSs, you know. There's always so much work. It's fun now. Like when I was in charge of VBS, it wasn't as fun, you know, because, man, that's a stressful week, you know. You've never had people avoid you like when you're the VBS director at church, you know. Like the month before VBS, people are like avoiding you like the plague, you know. They know you're coming to ask for some sort of help or something like that. So, but it's always so much fun to see, you know, the good that can come from all of those things. And you just never know how it's going to impact somebody. Last week I came into Clinton, and of course I'm a visitor. So I said hello to this fellow that was standing there. And I just happened to ask him, I said, so I'm just a visiting speaker. Are you a member of the church here? He goes, no, my wife's coworker, she just said they're having a VBS here tonight, and you know we thought it'd be a good night for a date night, so we're dropping the kids off. And I said, well, that's a good idea. I said, but make sure you come back early enough for us to get a chance to say hello to you. I'm sure there's some good people here, and you know you never know what will come from something, you know, like that. You know how that little kid that just his parents were taking advantage of a date night, you know. You never know. He may remember some of that, grow up in the church. They may be converted. That's why we do things like that. And I guess I say all of the effort is worth it, because you just don't know what God is going to do. You just don't know how God is going to work, and He works in unpredictable ways. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So let's get into it. Tonight we're talking about the character of the Bible, and I was telling Natalie this on the way down here, and it was funny because she was like, are you kidding me? The character that for at least the first 10 or 15 years of ministry, I pronounced his name with a P, Samson. Now, how many of you in here have been pronouncing his name Samson with a P? Be honest here, right? Now this is embarrassing. I was in Vanuatu, which is in the South Pacific. I do mission work down there. And the cab driver, which we're trying to have a conversation with about the gospel, his name is Samson. And he's got like his name tag hanging, or like his, down there you have to have like a license, I guess, to drive the buses around. And so his license said Samson. And I'm glad I didn't ask this because it would have been embarrassing, but I thought, he spelled his name wrong. He spelled it S-A-M-S-O-N. And I'm just like, whatever, you know, it's Vanuatu. They're backwards, I guess, you know. So then I get back to the hotel room, and I'm thinking, Samson. So I open up to the book of Judges, and sure as shooting, there's not a P in Samson. I'm thinking, how many times have I preached and said Samson, and it's Samson? And so I'm telling Natalie this, and she's like, you're joshing me. There's a P in Samson. I said, no, look it up. She's like, well, maybe in the King James Version, right? So, you know, we're Bible nerds. And she's like, well, apparently when it got translated into Greek, they added a P, but then the English put it back to the original Hebrew, and there's not a P. I'm thinking, boy, the things that we just overlook sometimes in our study of the Bible. So tonight, if I didn't teach you anything, at least I taught you there's not a P in Samson. It's S-A-M, all right? So let's open our Bible to the book of Judges, okay, as we talk about Samson tonight. One other little funny thing while you're turning there, I didn't grow up in the church, and I came into my Aunt Shelley's house in Bluefield, West Virginia one time, and I heard these parakeets, and she got these birds, and as a little kid I remember asking, what are their names? And she said, Samson and Delilah. I said, why did you call them Samson and Delilah? And she said, oh, those are characters in the Bible. And I didn't know any better, so I thought, oh, okay, got a couple of parakeets named Samson and Delilah. Well, then I got older, and I read my Bible, and I studied about Samson and Delilah. I thought, why would you name your birds Samson and Delilah? You know, what a weird name to name your birds, right? You know, I'm expecting one bird to wake up hairless one day or something like that. You know, the other one just, you know, scalped them or something like that. So when I think of Samson, I always think of walking into Aunt Shelley's house and asking, what are those birds' names, Samson and Delilah? Let me ask you a question. When you think of the biblical character of Samson, what do you think of? What comes to your mind when you think of Samson? Great strength? Yeah, just incredibly strong, like out of this world strong. Yeah. Anybody else? Oh, what was that? I'm sorry, say it one more time. A little dense. Thick-headed, maybe. Thick-headed, stubborn. Yes, some of us men are. So, yeah, a little dense, incredibly strong. Anybody else? How do you spell his name? Samson. Samson. That's what I think of now. So, anybody else? What do you think of when you think of Samson? Hair made him strong, right? Hair made him strong. You know, when I think of Samson, you know, maybe originally when I was a kid and I learned about who Samson was, you know, I thought of some of those things. Incredibly strong. He was a judge. You know, we could throw that in there. We know that he's found in the book of Judges, and he was a judge. And we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. But there's really two things that come to mind now, having studied the story of Samson a lot over the years, that I want to share with you. And from a human perspective, one thing that comes to mind is wasted strength. Wasted strength. You know, as we said, he was an incredibly strong, thick-headed individual, and God gave him strength. But in a lot of ways, when I read the story of Samson, I see someone that had so much potential. And yet, in a lot of ways, that strength was wasted. From a divine perspective, though, when I think about it, not necessarily from a human perspective, when I think about Samson from a divine perspective, and this is really where I'm going with this lesson tonight. When I think of Samson, I think of someone that really typifies this truth. And I think this is something we all could learn here. God is either going to work through us or in spite of us, but His will is going to be done. Now, whether He works alongside of us or with us, or He has to go around in spite of us and work, well, He gives us the choice, doesn't He? We get to choose how we allow God to work through our lives. And we get to choose. You know, Samson, here I go again with my P, right? Samson was thick-headed, and he was stubborn, and he was obstinate. He was also faithful at times. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And maybe this is a challenge that you have with some of these conflicted characters of the Bible, is you see this person, like I just taught on Song of Solomon, and there were some people that flat out told me in the class, I can't study this book with you because, why? Why can't you study Song of Solomon? It's a book of the Bible. And they said, because I just can't get around the fact that Solomon wrote the book. I mean, how can I listen to a book about the beauty of marital love written from a guy that had all these wives and concubines? And if and this was a mature, faithful Christian woman that said this to me. She just refused to study Song of Solomon because it was written by Solomon. If mature, faithful Christian people struggle with these conflicted characters of the Bible, imagine you're somebody that comes from the world. You've never grown up reading the Bible. You know, we're in a generation now where the kids that are growing up in the church here and kids that are growing up in the school, Natalie and I were teaching a lesson on Paul in VBS a few years back, and some boys from the community there in Virginia came into the room, and I was playing the character of Paul. And I was listening to the other side, and Natalie was telling them this story, and one of the little boys said, "You mean Paul was for real? Like he was a real person? Or was it Jesus?" Was it Jesus? Okay, that makes it even more sad. Yeah, it was Jesus. He said, "You mean Jesus is for real?" And Natalie said, "Yeah, he was real." For real? Like he was a real person? Like it just blew my mind that a little boy could grow up, and he was maybe 7, 8 years old, never heard of Jesus. Could you imagine never hearing of Jesus? Didn't know who he was. That's where we're at in our culture now. We better get used to it. We better get used to it. So if we're struggling, and this is how this relates to Samson, if we're struggling with these conflicted characters sometimes, what about people that come from the world and pick up the Bible? And like, am I supposed to believe that this man killed all these people with the jawbone of a donkey? Furthermore, what about, you know, you're preaching to me about morality. What about this dude? What about this guy? who was with these 3 women, and they were all bad women, and yet he's exalted. And so we need to get comfortable with the fact that a lot of times when we come to these conflicted characters in Scripture, really we're learning this truth, that God can work through the imperfect, including human beings, especially human beings. And I think we need to get comfortable with showing people, yeah, but what do we learn about God in this story? And here's where we fall short probably sometimes in our vacation Bible schools and things like that. And I get why we do this with the kids. We teach them the stuff that sticks out, like the great battle of Samson and killing all of the Philistines with the jawbone, or ripping the gates off of the city and carrying it and planting it up on the mountain, or even maybe we very carefully lean into Samson. I wonder how we handle this. Pushing the pillars down in the temple and it falling in, Teacher, does that mean he committed suicide? Whoa, how are you going to handle that one? That's a tough one there, isn't it? Sometimes we teach those things, but there's some more raw, some more deeper things that we shouldn't be afraid of in these stories. And we need to get comfortable with that. Because Samson's story is like my story in so many ways, or maybe even your story, where we're not perfect, squeaky clean people. And thank God that we're not. That God doesn't require, I should say, us to be that in order to enter into the kingdom of heaven. The fact of the matter is, God has always worked through conflicted characters, starting with the man in the mirror, right? And so when we think about this man Samson, let's not get caught up necessarily, and I'm speaking to adults here in this room, let's not get caught up necessarily in just looking at, the VBS version of Samson. The warrior Samson had killed all the Philistines with the jawbone. Let's not let that be our sum total of Samson. Nor let's just ignore the fact that this was a conflicted man. He had some moral problems, and yet he was also a man of faith that was exalted and mentioned as a man of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Okay? And so with that sort of backdrop in mind, let's lean into the story of Samson a little bit deeper tonight. And for the next 5 minutes, what I want to do is sort of build up to the story of Samson, because, nothing in the Bible is disconnected from other things that happen before it or things that come after it. And sometimes when we study things, we study them we compartmentalize and study them, which I know why we do that, but we forget that they're connected to other bigger things, especially when those bigger things that they're connected to are, say, promises of God. And to get to Samson in the book of Judges, you really got to go back to the book of Genesis. Go back to Genesis chapter 12, if you would, and let's just very briefly, in a couple of jumps, get ourselves to the time of Samson, all right? Look at Genesis chapter 12. And when you think of Genesis chapter 12, your mind needs to go to the man Abram, who was called Abram in this chapter. The word Abram simply means exalted father or well-respected father. The term Abraham means father of many nations. That's what the change of name means. And that all starts with this promise. Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. This is where God makes what is one of the biggest and most impactful promises in all of history to this man Abram, who will later become Abraham. It begins in Genesis 12 and verse 1, where it says, Now the Lord said to Abram, Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. If you're a Christian in here tonight, raise your hand. It's all right. Okay? You are a fulfillment of that promise. Because from this promise, Jesus Christ is going to come and fulfill this promise, in which a descendant from Abraham is going to bless all the families of the earth with salvation. If you're not a Christian and you're here tonight, I got good news for you. You have the opportunity tonight to be a part of that promise that we're reading about right here in Scripture, by obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ. But go back to this promise. this promise began to be fulfilled hundreds of years after Abraham lived. Where Abraham went into the promised land, but he sure didn't inherit it. And he wasn't a great nation when he died. In fact, those things would happen over time. But when God makes a promise, here's the thing. You can bank on it. God's always going to do His end of the covenant, of the promise. And God's going to renew this covenant with Abraham several times in the book of Genesis. So Judges needs to be understood in terms of this covenant that God made to Abraham. And so when we look at God being patient with these rebellious Israelites in the book of Judges, they keep going into this cycle of sin. You say, why does God keep doing that? You know, why does God keep being patient with these stubborn, hard-headed people? It's because God made a promise, you understand? And God doesn't just negate His promises because of our unwillingness to keep it. God's promise is something altogether different. God doesn't operate on my level. His ways are not my ways. His thoughts are not my thoughts. So, we fast forward through Genesis and Exodus, and now we get to, right, Abraham has died. The people have become in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. God has decided to finally bring them in and continue to fill that promise. So He does so through Moses. And then Moses leads, he was God's chosen instrument to lead Israel out of Egyptian bondage, just like God promised that He would do. He's fulfilling this promise to Abraham still. And He gives him the law. If you're going to be a nation, you have to have a law. And so He gives them the law there on Mount Sinai. And then after Moses dies, Moses passes the torch on to Joshua. Now they have been given a law. They've come into the land, but they haven't taken possession of the land yet. Not full possession of the land. So they're on their way to fulfilling this promise, but it hasn't been completely fulfilled just yet. And so when we get to the end of Joshua, you know, there's that great passage in Joshua chapter 24, and he basically says, choose today who you're going to serve. Are you going to serve the gods of this country or this land that we're entering into? Or are you going to serve the Lord? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, he says there. And that's where things are left off on when Joshua dies. That leads us to the book of Judges, okay, to the book of Judges. So go to the book of Judges now, and I just want to very briefly go to the first couple of chapters of Judges. Judges chapter 2, I want to start in verse 11, okay? But just glance your eyeballs over at Judges chapter 1 and notice very carefully what happens. So in Judges chapter 1, you've got Jerusalem, okay, being captured, or the city or the area where Jerusalem is going to be, that area is going to be captured. Now, if you know your later Old Testament history, you understand why that's important. Because in that place is the place where God says, I will make my name dwell there, and that's where, in David and Solomon's time, the temple is eventually constructed. So now you sort of see how that fits into the rest of Old Testament history. Then he has a list of other cities that they conquered, but, beginning in verse 27 of Judges chapter 1, it mentions all of the places that Israel did not conquer. So they were faithful in many ways, but there were also some places that they had already started to waver. Okay? And so in Judges chapter 2, all right, Israel is rebuked because not only were they not taking all the land that God said that they were to take, they began to worship the idols. They went right into idolatry. You know, there was a reason that the very first commandment of the Ten Commandments, what's the very first commandment of the Ten Commandments, folks? What is it? You shall have no other gods before me, because you don't live 400 years in Egypt around all those gods and culture not impact you. Right? We need to kind of listen to that comment too. So they lived 400 years down there in Egypt around all those pagan gods, and guess what? They struggled with it. And you don't have to read very far in the Old Testament to see that. Well, in the period of the Judges, you've got God working out His promise that He started with Abraham, still bringing this to fruition in spite of people's stubbornness. And then you have the people, right, that are already going into idolatry and already going into this cycle of sin that we see in the book of Judges. So let's read together now Judges chapter 2, beginning in verse 11. And I have the New American Standard 95. That's what I'm using tonight. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals. That becomes, underline it, put a highlight there, one of the key phrases of the book of Judges. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. It occurs several times in the book of Judges. And they forsook the Lord, their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and they bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord, and they served Baal and the Asheroth. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of the plunderers to plunder them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil. And the Lord had spoken, and as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. Then the Lord raised up judges, who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods, and they bowed themselves down to them. And they turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. And they did not do so as their fathers did. When the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity for their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. But it came about that when the judge died, that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers, in following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. And they did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. And he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant. See, there it is. What covenant? The covenant he made with Abraham. Because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I made with their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I also will no longer drive out for them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did or not. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Now these are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all who had experienced any of the wars of Canaan, only in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught war, those who had not experienced it formerly. One last verse and we'll stop there. These nations are the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites who lived in the mountain of Lebanon, and in Mount Baal Hermon, as far as Lebo Hamath. All right, so I just want to stop there, and we can actually read a little bit further, but for the sake of time, I want to stop there. So those verses that we just read there is really a summary of the whole book of Judges. So everything else that we're studying, including Samson tonight, and I promise we're going to get to Samson, but we don't study this Old Testament history as often as we should, so I want to do a little bit of that tonight. Everything else in the book of Judges is summarized in those words right there. And if you look at those particular passages, look at what it says. Verses 11 and 12, they forsook the Lord. How did they do that? They didn't keep their end of the covenant. They didn't do their end of the deal. God was keeping his end of the covenant, but they were not keeping their end of the covenant. Verse 14, and then the Lord became angry. After all that he had done for them, he became angry when they gave his affections to other gods. Verse 15, because he was angry at them, he was also against them. Verse 15, and the way that he was against them is he allowed those nations, right? He allowed those nations to persecute them, to oppress them all the days of the judges. There was this cycle of oppression and deliverance. And when God chose to deliver them, when it says he had pity, right? This goes back to Exodus 34 and the character that we know of God. God is merciful and gracious, but he's not willing to let sin go unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers even to the 4th generation, he says there in Exodus 34. This is just all part and parcel of the character of God. And then finally, verse 21, the Lord eventually, in the time of the judges, refused to drive out those nations any longer. Now here's how all that ties into Samson. Samson's going to be the last judge in the book of Judges. The 9th judge, I think it is. Maybe I'm one off there. Okay? And in the days of Samson, it's going to be the worst of the oppression. An entire generation of Israelites, 40 years of Israelites, are going to deal with constant Philistine oppression. Okay? So everything that we're going to read about in the rest of the book of Judges, including Samson, is really summarized here at the beginning of this. So, Samson, this last judge of Israel that is mentioned in the book of Judges, he's going to be the last judge that God sends in this book to deal with the oppression. And he's going to be, as I said at the very beginning of this, a very conflicted character. So, in the time that I have remaining tonight, 20 minutes or so, let me give you 3 things about Samson and about what we learn about Samson in Judges that I think we can learn from and things that we can make some practical application to. And then the lesson will be yours tonight. Go to Judges chapter 13 for just a second, okay? Judges chapter 13. And the first thing that, I wasn't a trumpet, so it's not the Lord. So he'll call a different way. One thing that I think we should probably teach our kids during our VBS lessons or something about Samson, and maybe we're teaching them tonight, and if so, that's great. That is, Samson had some really awesome parents. And because of his parents, he finds himself actually in very rare company. Samson becomes a judge, really, according to 13 verse 1, as I said a few minutes earlier, at the end of an entire generation of bondage. Just look at verse 1 of chapter 13 real quick. It says, "Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord." See, there's that expression we saw in Judges chapter 2. "So that the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. Think about how long that is to be oppressed by someone. That's an entire generation from a biblical standpoint. To be oppressed for 40 years is a long time. And yet, when God chose to deliver them with Samson, he sent the angel of the Lord. Okay? And I don't want to spend the time to read through all of this passage, but beginning in Judges chapter 13 and verse 3, and then going really all the way down through verse 14, you'll see at the beginning of verse 3, "Then the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and give birth to a son." Okay? And so Manoah and his wife was barren, were these faithful people in the midst of this crazy generation of upheaval. And it was to them that God sent the angel of the Lord, and he made this great promise that this barren woman would give birth. Now think about it. Just from what you know of the Bible, that alone puts Samson in pretty rare company as far as children coming into this world. Let's think about it. When it pertains to other events where God miraculously intervened and opened a woman's womb, who are some other characters that we could associate that act with in the Bible? Sarah and Abraham, right. We've already talked about them tonight. That's a big deal. Who else? Who was that? Hannah. Yeah, Hannah had brought forth Samuel. Who else? Elizabeth, who brought forth who? John the Baptist. Yeah, John the Baptizer. Rachel. Not Rachel. Oh, you're talking about when they were Rachel and Leah. I got you. Yes, I got you. Sorry, I wasn't connecting the dots there. I'm thinking of one other one in particular that's just sort of now she wasn't barren, but it was a miraculous event. Right, Mary with Jesus, right? So just from the surface, the fact that the Lord is intervening in this situation. And by the way, when you look at this particular passage here, not only does this put Samson in some pretty rare company as far as the scriptures go, when God miraculously intervened with a woman whose womb was barren and then allowed her to give birth, the one who shows up here, the angel of the Lord, is fascinating. You know, it's interesting because this passage really demonstrates that the angel of the Lord was deity. That really takes us back to Exodus chapter 3. I don't want to read it all, but go down to Judges chapter 13 and look at verse 16. So after the angel appeared 2 times to the woman, the second time Manoah, her husband, is able to interact with the angel of the Lord. They want to basically cook for him. They want to fix him food, you know. That's what we do when we get together as God's people. We eat, right? And so Manoah said, let's eat together. And this angel said, no, I'm not going to eat this food, but I will allow you to sacrifice it to the Lord. Okay, and beginning in verse 16, said, the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, though you detain me, I will not eat your food, but if you prepare a burnt offering, then offer it to the Lord. For Manoah did not know that he was the angel of the Lord. Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, what is your name? So that when your words come to pass, we may honor you. But the angel of the Lord said, why do you ask my name, seeing that it is wonderful? Or if you have another Bible that may translate that as incomprehensible. By the way, anybody know what the word Samson means? What his name means? What is it? Yeah, light or sunny, right? Sunny boy, right? No, that's not what it meant. But sunlight, right? That's what Grandpa calls you. Sunny boy, get over here and mow this grass, right? Sunlight or bright, right? And I can't prove this. This is just me thinking, having read this story many times. Why call him bright? Why call him magnificent? You know, usually these names in the Bible, they carry with them some interesting name or interesting meaning. I think it's because of the angel of the Lord who appeared to them in this majestic, bright figure. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. But if you keep reading through this, the angel of the Lord says, verse 19, so Manoah took the young goat with the grain offering, offered it on the rock to the Lord, and he performed wonders while Manoah and his wife looked on. For it came about, when the flame went up from the altar towards heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended into the flame of the altar. So literally, as that sacrifice is being offered up, the angel of the Lord goes up with that sacrifice. Verse 21 says, now the angel of the Lord did not appear to Manoah or his wife again. Then Manoah knew that it was the angel of the Lord. And then notice verse 22. So curious what he says here. So Manoah said to his wife, we will surely die, for we have seen God. Now, I don't know how much more proof you need that the angel of the Lord was deity, but that's pretty convincing to me right there. It's just so fascinating. And we don't have time to go into it, but I certainly believe that the angel of the Lord was, in fact, the pre-incarnate Christ. You can go to 1 Corinthians 10, and Paul pretty much says that was the case. But let me just touch base on a few things here, and then I want to move on to some other things about Samson. So, you know, we discuss Samson, his strength, his great acts of faith, and in his feats, but as I said a few moments ago, we don't really focus enough on the background of how he became a judge. And somebody says, well, Mike, why is that significant? Why are we emphasizing this tonight? Well, let me tell you, I think Samson's story is one about the grace of God given to a good family in a really hard time. Remember what I said at the beginning of this lesson. I really think we need to be listening in these stories about what they teach us about God. Sometimes we want to connect with the human element of these stories, don't we? And so we look at Samson and we try to connect with, he was a strong man and those sorts of things. But boy, when I start to see Samson's story right from the beginning, you know what I see? I see a faithful family in a difficult generation, and God blessed them with his grace. It teaches us something about God, doesn't it? It teaches us that he's graceful. And you know, it seems to me that this is how the Jews and even the early Christians were able to draw strength from this story, these kind of stories. Not in necessarily focusing on the strengths and the weaknesses of the characters, but focusing on the redeeming aspects of those characters as it relates to the God that they served. Such as the faith that we're going to talk about in a moment that Samson had. And so we should be asking the question, I think, what does this story of Samson teach us about God? That's a good one to ask them, Lee, when they come in here tonight. See what one of the kids say, right? What does the story of Samson, young people, teach us about God? Yes, sir. Say that again. Faith. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry if I'm hard of hearing. I need to get some hearing aids one of these days. And so if I walk a little bit closer to you, I'm not trying to be intimidating or anything like that. I just really am hard of hearing. Let me go on to the second thing real quick. I want to shift just very quickly away from the divine reflection that we're talking about here, how we can look at the story of Samson and we can really pull from that things that teach us about God. But I want to, before I skip too far past it here, I want to focus on Samson and some of the ways that we can relate to him. Because really he was a champion, but he was a childish champion, wasn't he? When I think about Samson. Samson was the enemy of God's people for the entire time that he was a judge. The text says that he judged Israel for a period of 20 years. And it was a period of 40 years before that when the Philistines had oppressed them. And so this made him a champion. Because he would fight the battles of God's people for them, he was a champion. Furthermore, if you read the story of Samson, it also appears that he was a very wise individual. And so these two things combined, they really make up the sum of what I would call the positive contributions of Samson as a judge of Israel. He was willing to go out and fight against the enemies of God's people, and he was a wise judge. Those two things are often associated with the judges that we read about in the Scriptures. And so if you'll skip forward now to Judges 14 and verse 4, this is one of those verses that really jumps out at me as significant. Judges 14 verse 4 says, however, this is when Samson wanted to go down and to marry a woman from the Philistines. And it says, however, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now at that time the Philistines were ruling over Israel. And so it's a curious verse. And though we don't have time to fully flesh this out tonight, this is one of those verses of the Bible that really speaks about the providence of God, if you think about that. Here's Samson, and he's responding according to the flesh as a man does. There's a pretty girl down there with the Philistines, and I want you to go get her for me, Dad. No, why can't you go and get one from among your own people? And the text, instead of saying, well, Samson rebelled against his father and mother, said, no, go get one anyway, the text tells us actually God was working through this poor decision of Samson to go get a woman from the Philistines to bring about an occasion to smite the Philistines, who were the enemy of his people. It's such a curious verse. And yet, sadly, the weakness of the flesh that we see of Samson in this is going to continue to be what plagues him as a leader. And so he was this childish and arrogant leader. Because what we see in the rest of the story is, yes, God providentially works through Samson to go down and strike the Philistines. But Samson, in the weakness of his flesh, continues to make mistakes and go against that good upbringing and go against the law of God. And so 3 times we read about in the story of Samson how he gives in to the flesh. One time with this first wife who was of the Philistines. Second time he gives in to a harlot that he had relations with. And then the third time is the one that we often talk about, and that's Delilah. So I don't know if you realize it or not, but there's actually 3 women in the story of Samson that caused Samson to fall. Furthermore, in addition to the lust of the flesh that Samson would give into, which really prevents him from being a good leader, he was, and I think we said this at the beginning, he was an impetuous man. And he was hot-headed and thick-headed. And here's the thing that really, frustrates me when I read about Samson is he didn't think about his parents, that God had done such wonderful things. He didn't think about the people that he was leading. And so you have this one person, and this is where the conflict comes in of character. You've got someone who has amazing strength and amazing faith that's willing to go out and fight the battles for God's people. And then he turns right around and he gives in to sin. And it's just so frustrating, right? And that leads me to, maybe a practical application of this. Samson would go across the border and he would fight the battles for God's people. The next time he would go across the border, he would go and give in to the lust of the flesh and be with a woman he shouldn't have. And when I think about that, I think I could put it like this. Are we crossing the border to serve God? Or are we crossing the border to fulfill our appetites? And what I mean is, are we going out into the world, and are we looking at our job and our mission in the world to go out and to serve God? Or when we go out into the world, are we just going out to fulfill our appetites? You know, which side of Samson's character are we going to choose to emulate? The one that goes out into the world and fights God's battles, or the one that goes out into the world and crosses the border to sin? And that really leads me to this last thing that I want to touch base on in the last couple of minutes that I have, and that is this, and this is what I started with. In the story of Samson, we learn this point, that God either works with us or He works in spite of us. And so when you just step back from the story of Samson, his whole life was a series of demonstrations of God's power and human folly, wasn't it? His whole life was just a demonstration of the power of God working through one man, or it's a demonstration of the foolishness of a man, stubborn, thick-headed, going into sin. And in the end, Samson's life is a powerful demonstration, sadly, of both God's power and human folly. Because when you get all the way to the end of the story of Samson, Judges chapter 16, verses 21 through 31, after the Philistines have taken Samson captivity, once Delilah spilled the beans about where his power came from and cut his hair, and they gouged his eyes out. I mean, think about it. Anytime in Scripture darkness is associated with the character, it's not a good thing. And so they gouge out Samson's eyes, and they leave him as this spectacle. And then here he is at the very end, and in one last act of faith, he grabs those pillars, and he pushes them. And it says that there were 3,000 Philistines on the roof alone, not including all of the Philistines that were inside of the building. And those pillars fell down upon him. And so the story of Samson ends with, this tragic conflict of character with his death. Notice the way that it ends, though. It brings it back full circle, and I appreciate the biblical writer doing this. Judges chapter 16, or verse 31, "Then his brothers and all his father's household came down, took him, brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah's fathers." So here's this boy who struck out on his own against his father's will and his father's advice, and he came back home. But he didn't come back home the way his family would have liked. He came back home, as we might say, in an old pine box. And it's such a conflicted and such a moving story. And when I think about the story of Samson on a deeper level, like we've just very briefly scratched the surface, the story of Samson and the people of his day is a story of triumph and a story of tragedy. And in spite of all of that, God was working, His faithfulness was working through those things, right? And it really teaches us that even if we are unfaithful, God remains faithful. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13. And so I know we're at the bottom of the hour, and we're out of time. And so let me just very quickly throw out a few things, and then maybe I'll have 30 seconds for a comment. Let me just throw out some key takeaways that I jotted down, and then this lesson will be yours. Number one, we need to be asking the question when we come to these conflicted characters, what do we learn about God through the story of Samson? And I think we need to be teaching our kids to constantly be asking those questions. And we encounter the skeptics who are encountering the Bible for the first time. Our response, we better be prepared to give an answer to that. We can't be making excuses for Samson's questionable character and sort of skirting it off to the side. God surely doesn't do that, because this isn't really about Samson. This book is not just about Samson. This book is about God working through Samson, just like He's going to work through my life as well. And then the second key takeaway, are we going to go into the world to serve the Lord, or are we going to just go out into the world to fulfill our appetites? Thirdly, is God going to work with us, or is God going to work in spite of us? And then finally, do we have faith like Samson did? Samson was someone you could like, and he was also someone you could find fault with. But when it came down to it at the end of his life, he trusted God. In spite of all the mistakes that he had made, in spite of all of his faults, Samson was someone who went back to the Lord and said, well, it's like this old song that Brother Willie used to sing. I have sinned against you, Lord. I admit that I've done wrong. I'm just like the prodigal son. I ran away from home. Now I'm down on my bended knee, telling you to forgive this soul of mine. Please forgive me, Jesus, and try me one more time. Man, that's an encouraging story of Samson, that in spite of all of his faults, he just continued to go back to the well that is the Lord. All right, questions or comments from our very quick and brief study of Samson tonight? Lots. Just remember, it's Samson without a P, all right? That's the main thing.